Like, most people don't go for a 2-hour drive at 4:30 in the morning without a solid purpose. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, please do subscribe, and if you're old here, hello again. My name's Kay Philpott and I cover true crime and missing person cases on my channel. I just want to say happy Thanksgiving to those of you that are Thanksgiving celebrators, and also happy Black Friday for the day this comes out. I knew this video would be coming out on Black Friday and I wanted to cover a case that took place on that exact day. That means that today, the day you're seeing this, is the anniversary of this case taking place. It is the 12th anniversary of the disappearance of Andrew Alexander and Tanner Skelton, who went missing back in 2010. I had 37 pages of notes on this case, and there's a reason for that. So I urge you to grab yourself a hot chocolate or a bucket of popcorn, because we're going to be here for a while. All I have to say is buckle up and do your best to remain as objective as possible, because there really are a lot of different ways that this could have gone. The three boys were playing in the garden of their dad's house one minute and gone the next. But even as I'm saying that, honestly, things are really not as they seem. Let's start with the boys themselves. Andrew was the oldest. He was 9 years old when the boys disappeared, and he was the smart and quiet one. He was born on the 20th of November 2001, meaning we've just passed his 21st birthday just this past week. He was very analytical and curious, to the point where he obtained the nickname the National Enquirer, and he was described as wise beyond his years. He absolutely loved video games and was really good at them, like whooped everyone's ass. And then you have Alexander. He was born on the 4th of November 2003, so he would have just passed his 19th birthday just a few weeks ago, but he was 7 at the time of their disappearance. Alexander had kind of two sides to him. One side was this daredevil. He loved doing stunts on his bike. He'd always get into trouble for doing like mad stuff. And the other side was this really sweet, affectionate side, where he just wanted to cuddle up on the couch with his parents, and he was really in his element there too. And lastly, we have Tanner. He was the youngest. He was born on the 20th of October 2005, making him only 5 years old when they disappeared. All their birthdays were within a month of each other. And Tanner was the one with the unlimited imagination, and he loved just being the center of attention, and he was also always Alexander's shadow. Like, anything Alex could do, so could he. Overall, the three boys were very well behaved. They were so loved by their parents, John and Tanya, and they were even adored in their community. It was a small town they grew up in, Morenci, Michigan, and everyone knew these kids. Everyone knew them as the boys who were always out playing, having a good time. They seemed very happy. The whole family unit just seemed like the ideal family unit, but that's the thing. Seemed like. But before I explain what I mean by that, let's dive into John and Tanya for a minute, their parents. John had grown up in Florida, but he was in the military for a while, so he travelled to many places in the US. He'd been married previously, had a daughter from this previous marriage as well. But when they divorced, he actually lost custody. I tried to find out why, and I couldn't, so there's that. But he did have visitation rights. But to be honest, it was still tough for him to see his daughter regularly anyway, because he didn't live in the same state. And when he met Tanya, he fell madly in love and decided to settle there in Morenci because that's where she was. It just made total sense to him. And at this time, he got a job as a truck driver. Let's also be aware that John had been to jail at some point for failing to pay child support to that previous wife. But anyway, I'm not going to hone in on that too much. Let's move on to Tanya real quick. Tanya had also been married previously, and she had had 2 daughters from that previous marriage. And this was quite some time before the Skelton brothers were born, so those 2 daughters were quite a bit older. That marriage ended badly, very badly, though, because Tanya got into some trouble with the law, we'll say. She was charged in 1998 with having an inappropriate sexual relationship with, this is hard to say, but a 14-year-old. Bear in mind, she would have been into her 30s at this point. And she pled guilty, and she was put on the sex offender registry, went to prison, and all of that, right? Now, obviously, Tanya wasn't proud of this. I mean, how could she be? But it was her history, and she worked through it mentally and focused on her own growth the best she could. And, I mean, she moved on fairly well from this. Like, it didn't seem like there were any relapses or in judgment or anything like that. And I'm sure you're wondering if John knew about this before they got together, and actually he did. So any decision he made related to Tanya, dating her, marrying her, having kids with her, like, he did all of that knowing that this was her history. And I want you to keep that in mind as we move forward. John and Tanya had a pretty happy relationship. They loved each other. They loved their kids. They just were happy. They were essentially this perfect family dynamic, the kind of thing that people wish for, at least for the first 8 years. So you'll see. They got married in 2002, and it was in 2010 that some stuff started going down. So when John went to the school reunion down in Florida, I believe it was September 2010, he reconnected with some old friends. He had the time of his life, and he just couldn't get Florida out of his mind. Bear in mind, this was where he grew up, like, so there was an element of nostalgia there, and he was just on such a high from this trip. He ended up wanting the whole family to move there. He could even get better pay down there. The weather is much nicer, warmer and all that. So he thought it would be amazing for the family, like the boys, to grow up in the warmth and they can play out in the sun and just all of this stuff. Now, Tanya shot this down pretty much immediately. The boys were just settling into the new school year. Tanner, it was his first year in school, so what does that make him in kindergarten? They were around family in Morenci, Michigan. Tanya herself hated the heat, not to mention she had felony charges. And that complicates things a lot if you try to move to another state. So you can only imagine how this would have burst John's bubble. And then it caused him to do something very strange. That's a very light word to use for it, but anyway. One Monday morning in that September, which is literally the same month that he'd been to this school reunion, Tanya checked the boys into school and, dropped some medications into the receptionist, had a quick chat with her, and she went off to run some errands. When she got home though, so this couldn't have been too long, right? She went home, she noticed that she had a few missed calls on the landline, and they were all from the school. What's that about? So she called back, and the receptionist said that she saw something weird, that not long after Tanya checked the boys into school, John came and checked them right out, saying that they were all going on a family trip to Florida. Of course, the receptionist thought it was weird. Tanya hadn't even mentioned it. Surely you'd be like, oh, by the way, the boys won't be in for the full school day. We're going to be collecting them early, or John will be collecting them early because we're all going to Florida, or oh yeah, have some things to do now before we go to Florida later today. There was none of that. So Tanya is confused and panicked, honestly, and she calls John. John told her then that he picked them up to bring them to Florida, so that part is true, for a few weeks. Sorry? A few weeks. Okay. So John is also really confused as to why Tanya was freaking out, because she'd told him that she didn't want to go with them. Dude, Tanya didn't want to move to Florida because that's what had been brought up previously. A trip to Florida hadn't even been a conversation. What? Those are two very different conversations. John even told Tanya that he was going to enroll them in school in Florida so that they wouldn't miss out. So f***ing weird. I think we can all agree a few weeks is too long for the kids to be out of school fully, right? But it's also too short to enroll in a whole other school, in a whole other state. Just doesn't quite add up. Honestly, to me, sounds like plans to just move there, but it didn't quite get to that point. You'll see why. So Tanya gets off this phone call and she's panicked, obviously. She contacts an attorney and she contacts authorities. Authorities couldn't exactly help her because John was their father and legally he could bring them wherever he wants, but there was a loophole. She could stop him leaving the state with the boys if she filed for divorce and immediate emergency custody of them. Obviously a hard decision because all of this was so sudden, it happened so fast, But John was essentially about to kidnap their kids and bring them to a whole other state. So at the end of the day, she really had no other choice. And she decided to go through with it. The only problem was she needed access to him so that he could be served the divorce papers. So she needed to come up with a plan to get him back to the house. So she called him with this ruse and said, all right, do you know what? Fine. You can bring them to Florida, but John, like, I've worked in a school before. You can't just rock up with the kids and enroll. Like, you have to have all the documents you need, birth certs you need, social security cards you need, blah, 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 blah. Right? So she's kind of making it seem like she's helping him out, when really she's just like, I just need this guy to get here so that I can serve him these divorce papers and get emergency custody of these kids. So John's there like, oh, yeah, you're probably right. And he ends up going back to the house. So while all this is happening and he's on his way back to the house, Tanya gets her 2 daughters from her previous marriage to go down to the attorney to pay him the retainer and come back to the house with an officer to serve the papers. So Tanya is searching all around the house, high and low, looking for these documents. Between you and me, she knew exactly where they were. She would have found them in 5 minutes. But, you know, she needed to buy herself some time. Now, here's where things get interesting. Out of nowhere, when John is in the house, he loses his shit because he'd gotten a phone call from Tanya's attorney. And get this, John had the same plan. John had already been in contact with this very attorney. And this phone call was that attorney saying, yo, John, I can't represent you because I'm representing your wife. That's gotta hurt. That's gotta hurt. Because of this, John knew exactly what the plan was. He knew exactly what Tanya was about to do because he was about to do it himself. He was just too little too late paying the retainer. So he's screaming, he's crying, he's losing his at Tanya, and he runs outside, grabs Andrew and Alexander, they were playing in the garden, throws them into his car and bombs off down the road. He couldn't get Tanner because Tanya's friend had been there as well. She grabbed him first. But all the kids are now crying and confused and there's screaming out on the street. Tanya's sister stands out on the road in front of John to try and stop him. But he is like a bull and he just goes. And the most sickening thing is he just made it out in time because less than 60 seconds later, the officer and Tanya's 2 daughters show up with the documents. By the way, there were about 200 attorneys that either of them could have picked. So the chances of them both picking the same attorney and for things to happen this way, it was just like unbelievable, an insane coincidence. So now, John has set off on the 15+ hour drive to Florida with Andrew and Alexander in the car. And they ended up staying with a woman called Hillary. Hillary was someone that John had reconnected with at the reunion. So there's that. Some people have speculated about there being like a potential romantic connection there. Apparently it's a dead end, and to be honest, I don't really know what that would even add. And strangely enough, the following day after this was actually Tanya's birthday. So despite all the craziness going on, John let the boys call Tanya and wish her a happy birthday. And that's actually how she found out that they were staying with this woman called Hillary, because previously she had assumed that they were just staying with their grandmother who actually lived down there. Why they weren't, I don't know, but anyway. So Tanya was able to take this information and find out the exact address. So then Tanya went down to Florida. She got an attorney in Florida, and surprise, surprise, John already had one as well. The first thing John did when they all met up to discuss this shit show was accuse Tanya of abusing their sons. When I say abusing, let's just say he used her past against her, and that's the kind of abuse we're talking about here. This past, which by the way, he previously had no issue with. And this whole thing actually ended with Tanya receiving that full emergency custody of the boys, and John just got visitation rights. To be honest, Tanya only even offered him visitation rights because it would probably work in her favor in front of the judge when it came to the actual divorce. So they went home to Morenci, Michigan, and this happy family, their whole world, it was just flipped upside down. It had previously been so happy and joyful. It was just a mess. Their family was split. John and Tanya's marriage was f***ed. The boys were traumatized. It was like a complete mess. John and Tanya ended up going to marriage counseling, but honestly, this was basically just to keep John at bay, because Tanya was at a point now where it was done. Like, the trust was broken. She just wanted the divorce to go through at this stage. Tanya and their 3 boys moved out then into a family member's empty house, which was unfortunately literally 2 blocks away. Tanya could see John's house from the window of her new house. But they continued on for a while, John visiting regularly with no major issues. But then we moved closer to Thanksgiving. Now, obviously, I'm putting this video out on Black Friday, so we're getting close to the action. So they're trying to figure out who would have the kids for Thanksgiving. They decided that John would have the boys from Wednesday the 24th to Friday the 26th of November at 3 p.m. And John was not happy with this. He wanted more time with them. But this ended up being the final decision. So he picked them up on the Wednesday, and then it could have been that night, or to be honest, more likely the following night. This is just based off Tanya's memory. And bear in mind, the following night would have been Thanksgiving. John called Tanya incredibly worked up. He kept asking her if she thought they were going to be able to patch things up and get back together and just work it out and go back to normal. And I mean, this dude, Tanya, being completely honest, was like, I don't know. Like, she was not confident about being able to give him a yes. And John had really just fucking thrown everything they had away. He just took them to Florida out of nowhere, like, without telling her. Oh my God. Like, and that wasn't even all he'd done that pissed her off. So the weekend before Thanksgiving, I can't even imagine how livid I would be if somebody did this. Okay. John sat the 3 boys down and he told them about Tanya's history, that she was on the sex offender registry and just everything, that she'd been to prison, everything. These boys were 5, 7, and 9. They didn't need to know that about their mother. Maybe their mother deserved it for doing what she did, but whoo, she was pissed. So there were now 2 major things that John had done to really just everything up. So yes, on that phone call on either Thanksgiving night or the night before, it was impossible for her to say that everything was going to work out fine. Like, how could she? It's also important to note that during this phone call, she heard the boys playing in the background. Like, she even commented on it, like, oh my God, what are they up to? They're probably screaming and doing all sorts. On that Thursday, a neighbour had seen them playing outside as well. But that night, he posted on Facebook saying, "I love my wife very much. May God and Tanya forgive me." What the is going on? So the following day, obviously this is Black Friday. Tanya was wondering if she could maybe pick the boys up a little earlier than they'd said. She was hoping around midday she could pick them up. So she called John to ask. And he said, "Oh, sorry. We're in Jackson, which is a city about an hour north of Morenci." Why? Okay. Whatever, maybe you wanted to have a fun day out, fun morning out before they have to go back to their mom. That's fine. But John said they actually went up the day before to celebrate Thanksgiving with the Taylor family. Who the is the Taylor family? The Taylor family was the family of Joanne Taylor, quite an important name in this case. Tanya had never met this Joanne Taylor, but she'd been hearing this name, honestly, since the Florida incident back in September, 2 months prior. And she'd even received a friend request on Facebook from Joanne Taylor. So, you know, whatever. She hasn't met her, but the kids are still with John, so no big deal, right? So she said, okay, yeah, like, no worries. But in that moment, she looked out the window and obviously being able to see John's house from her window, she noticed that his van was still there. And she's like, "Hey, John, what's the story with your van? If you're out of town, how is your van still in the driveway?" And he said, "Oh, yeah, I didn't take my car because I didn't know the route. So Joanne and her family actually came to pick us up yesterday. By the way, I'll just mention again, John had been working as a truck driver, so, you know, he really knew all the local roads very well. And also, sat-nav existed. But anyway, whatever. John just kept throwing random details at her, and none of them were really making any sense or adding up to the same story. So it was very hard for her to even follow along what he was trying to say. And at a certain point, she was just like, okay, what in the world? What is going on? What's the story? So he said, okay, look, I lied before. I am home, but the boys are in Jackson because John apparently had to do some housework. So the boys stayed the night in Joanne's. I'm just going to remind you, this is the very man who was already not happy about how little time he was being allowed to spend with his boys over Thanksgiving. So does that make any sense? You can prioritize your housework another f***ing time, bro. This time with your kids over Thanksgiving is precious. And you are the very person who said that in the beginning. And if he really needed someone to look after them, why not just give them back to Tanya? Like, it doesn't make sense. Like, she's their mother, first of all, and she was only around the corner. Like, literally 2 blocks away. You wouldn't even have to drive. With that in mind, there must have been a reason. There must have been a reason why he would want to drive them or have them driven over an hour away. So that phone call ends and Tanya is very confused. She had tried to get Joanne's address or contact information from John, but he couldn't provide it for some reason. So John was the only person that could reach Joanne Taylor. So next thing you know, John calls Tanya again and he's actually on the way to the hospital. So this just gets weirder and weirder. And he's saying that he thinks he broke his foot because he was doing housework. That housework we were talking about, right? Tanya now is really starting to panic. All of these things adding up on top of each other are just painting a very strange picture. And all she wants is to have her sons back. And at this point, she has a really bad feeling about the whole thing. And she was right too. So not knowing what else to do, she calls her attorney. And he says, look, wait until after 3 p.m, the original time they were supposed to be back. And if there's still no sign, then we can talk next steps. If she had done anything too early, it could end up messing with the divorce process, and that's the last thing they needed. So, I mean, she couldn't exactly relax over those 2 to 3 hours. I'm sure it was a long 2 to 3 hours. But she called the hospital to try and find out more information. Like, she is still his wife, so she's entitled to that information. And they told her that actually he broke his foot attempting to take his own life. So, again, weirder and weirder. And it was all adding up to paint a worse and worse picture, honestly. And it was at this point that she reported the boys missing. She went over to John's house just to see if maybe the boys were just in there and he lost his and just left, I don't know. Or, you know, maybe she could find out some more information. So she went over with her sister. Her attorney was saying, like, do not go in the house again. This could be used against her massively in the divorce. But her sister didn't exactly have to follow those rules, so she could try to go in. She tried via the front door, the back door, and she had the same issue with both. Something was blocking the door. Now, fast forward to 3 p.m. and eventually it passed. 3:15, 3:30, no sign of the boys. And no sign of Joanne Taylor. She was the one who was supposed to drop them back. No sign. So on this day, an Amber Alert was put out for the boys, and the FBI were even on their way and would be there to help them in the search by the following morning. Literally went from 0 to 100 in minutes. So this weekend, the first weekend the boys were missing, people came from all over to help search for the boys, citizens and authorities, and nobody took this lightly. And of course, investigators had to search John's home, and they found quite a scene in there. A bunch of his belongings had just been absolutely mauled, like destroyed. Vases smashed, furniture destroyed, and the mattress of the bed had been stabbed repeatedly with a knife. And interestingly enough, everything that had been destroyed was something that was symbolic of John and Tanya's marriage. So that was that. That mattress was the mattress they slept together on for their 8 happy years of marriage. They also allegedly found items like bottles of bleach, stain remover, and odor remover. So it's up to you if you think these would be things you'd typically find in your house anyway. But anyway, they then seized all of his electronics, and they also seized Tanya's. But the difference was they didn't find anything in Tanya's. In John's computer, though, they found some interesting internet searches. For example, can you break someone's neck with your bare hands? And does rat poison kill children? What they didn't find in John's electronics was any sign of Joanne Taylor. So naturally enough, they bring him in for questioning. Now, before we get into that, obviously they searched all Tanya's house and all Tanya's stuff as well, but they just didn't really find anything there. In brief, John's explanation of this whole thing goes as follows. He and the boys had been watching a movie on Thanksgiving night, and in that movie, someone was, strangled or something like that. And the boys, curious as they were, started asking questions about it. So he Googled it. But what about the poison part? Conveniently enough, John doesn't recall this part. But then he goes on to say, well, also in the movie we watched, a woman got poisoned as well. All right, John, which lie are you going with? Because if you go with both are clearly not looking very likely to be the truth. So it's I just don't know what he was thinking. Anyway, he also fed them their favorite meal that night, fried chicken, and they had cake as well, and this matched what they found on the plates in the house the next day. So then the police start asking about Joanne Taylor, and John couldn't provide anything, really, any helpful information to help find this woman, to contact her, this woman who had apparently had their 3 boys. It's so unhelpful. And if he was trying to help them out and prove his innocence and his credibility, wouldn't he be like, oh my god, okay, that's so weird, she must have been using a fake name. Here, this is exactly what she looked like, this is exactly what car she drove, this is where she lived, because didn't they go to Thanksgiving that night together in the Taylor's house? Yeah, just this is the contact number I had for her, all of these things. But he didn't do that. He couldn't do that. And he said he gave the boys away in an attempt to protect them from Tanya, who was abusing them, again in that way. Weird how he only really uses that when he could potentially gain from it. So this is his story. And although Tanya had this history, she wasn't perfect, there really was nothing that could back up these claims. And anyone who knew Tanya now was absolutely not. She loved those kids. She would never. John also said that the status he wrote on Facebook was something that he wrote when he was depressed and spiraling. So putting all these pieces together, John is looking sketchy as let's be real. And nothing is making sense in his story. So they obtain access to his phone's locational data from Thanksgiving night and Black Friday morning. And they found some very interesting stuff in there. On the morning of Black Friday, 2010, at 4:29 a.m., John's phone pinged 3 miles away from his house, and it was heading towards Ohio. At 5 a.m., it pinged in Holiday City, which is in Ohio. It's about 30 minutes away from his house, so obviously he was heading in that direction. And as soon as this ping went off, the phone goes silent. So it either died or was purposely turned off. Pretty bloody convenient. And also very typical of someone trying to hide something. But let's not, let's leave that there. At 6:46 a.m. then, his phone pinged again at John's house. Now, when you take away the 30-minute drive back to John's house from Holiday City, that still leaves 76 minutes completely unaccounted for. And they couldn't find out what happened in this time anywhere. like no CCTV footage, no witnesses, nothing. He could very well have gone further than Holiday City. Like, that's just where the pings ended, because that's where the phone goes silent. But if so, where? And for what? Like, most people don't go for a 2-hour drive at 4:30 in the morning without a solid purpose. John's explanation of this Black Friday morning drive then, he says he didn't go anywhere. Someone else had his van and his phone must have been just in the vehicle when they took it. He didn't want to say who had his van though. And when he was asked about it, all he said was, someone I don't want to say. He went on to admit that it was someone in Joanne's party, and he hinted that he was romantically involved with this person. He's just giving crumbs of information without actually giving enough to help the situation. With all of this information then, authorities went ahead and charged John with 3 counts of kidnapping and 3 counts of unlawful imprisonment. Now John is awaiting trial. And during this time, while he's awaiting trial, there are 2 main leads for authorities to go off. The first being Holiday City. That's a location we know he was in just as the boys were going missing. And the second being Joanne Taylor. So for Holiday City, they searched everywhere they could in and around that area. They searched dumpsters, alleys, gas stations. They spoke to everyone they could, but there was no sign of anything or anyone that could help. Although I will say by this point, the dumpsters would most likely have been emptied, so they could very well have missed something there. And for the Joanne Taylor lead, firstly, she lived in a complete opposite direction from Morenci to Holiday City. Holiday City was south and Jackson, where Joanne Taylor lived, was north. And nobody in Morenci or Jackson knew this woman, which is a little weird. And with further digging behind Joanne's Facebook page, they found out that John Skelton himself had created the Joanne Taylor page. And Joanne Taylor never even existed. And when they went back to John with this information, he changed his story again. He said that he actually handed the kids over to some underground society or an organization. And he's just all over the place really, because the name of this organization kept changing. But what's interesting is the reason he says he handed the kids over remained the same the whole time: to protect them from Tanya. And when John's trial did eventually come around, he was highly emotional, and he claimed that he had to give the kids away because he had no other options and the system made him do it. He pleaded no contest and ended up being sentenced to 10 to 15 years. And this was in 2011. For 4 of those years, John was put in solitary and honestly given no explanation for that whatsoever. And I'll tell you this, to this day, John claims he never and would never hurt his children, and that he knows they're alive and safe. Okay. Let's also realize that if Tanya was abusive, of course he wouldn't want to give details on their whereabouts. But also for the few days after the boys disappeared, John was uncontrollably emotional. Apparently the kind of emotion you see in people who are grieving the loss of a loved one. And I mean, is that because he knew they were no longer alive? Or is it just because he knew, if he actually handed them over to an organization, did he know he wasn't going to see them for a very long time because they were with this group? Now, when John switched to the underground society story, he mentioned 3 names in particular: Sue, Virgil, and Elijah. The most random names you can get. Anyway, he is pretty sure that these were fake names. And what he claimed was that he met these people at a truck stop in Niles, Michigan, which is 2 hours away from Morenci. I mean, that's fair enough. He was a truck driver. But they got to talking somehow, and they stayed in contact from there for months. These people came over to the house multiple times to get to know the boys. I don't know, was this before or after the Florida incident? It definitely happened after, but did it start before? Because surely, Tanya would have known. But I'm also curious as to if the neighbors noticed any regular visitors. Whatever. There was also whispers about them potentially having other kids that they brought over to play with the boys. And they themselves are rumoured to be a foster family linked to this underground society, okay? Thanksgiving night then, they showed up at 10 p.m, this is according to John, to collect the boys and have them stay overnight as a trial run because, you know, he knew that he was going to be handing them over. He wanted to see how they would get on and blah, blah, blah. But this trial run turned into them never making contact again and never bringing the boys back. And John thinks he was just tricked, that they pulled the wool over his eyes, and these people that he handed his boys over to were people with ill intentions. It all seems a little much. Okay, I'm trying to remain objective. Okay, let's do that. But John has also claimed that he knows where the boys are, that they're living on the Ohio-Indiana border on a farm, and they've plenty of space to run around and play, which sounds absurdly like what you would tell a young child about their pet that had to be put down. But that's just speculation. But let's be honest, that Black Friday morning drive could have been him driving to hand over the boys. And if you look at the maps, that timeline would add up. 30 minutes to get to Holiday City and another, say, 20 to 30 minutes heading towards the border, and then another, so what would that be, 50 to 60 minutes back again? That would add up. It would. And on another occasion, he did say that he wrapped each of the boys in a blanket, gave them a stuffed animal, put them in his van, and drove them away. And I don't know, I just wonder what he means by this. Like, is this something he did when the boys were asleep? Were they unconscious? Were they alive at all? We really don't know. And again, it just doesn't add up with all of these different stories. Like, did they come to the house and take them away? Or did you bring them somewhere and pass them over to someone? Like, why? I don't know. Are we getting sprinkles of the truth and then just a bunch of this other stuff? I don't know. But even if this is believable about driving them somewhere and giving them to someone, why not say that from the start? He says that the children will hibernate until they graduate, which is kind of a weird way to put it, but why he just keeps changing things, and his family are like, yeah, no, the kids are fine. We'll get into that in a second, but it's just weird. So then he introduces another character to this underground society narrative, and that's a guy called Mose. Oh, I don't know how to pronounce his name. Gingerich? I don't know. Mose grew up Amish, but he left the community in 2002 and actually ended up having his own TV show. And John claimed that the underground organization told him that Mose would know where his boys were, and that when he got out of prison, he'd go to him and Mose would bring him to his boys. So John had come out with this information, right? And Mose heard about it, and he took it upon himself to speak directly to John in prison. He told him that he never received the 3 boys, and if John did give them to some organization, that there was a disconnect between them and him, because he hadn't even heard of this case until a long, long time after they actually went missing, like a few months prior to him visiting John in prison, which, to be honest, I don't know when exactly that was, but the boys have been missing for a long time. Now, when John heard this, he became so emotional. He said that that was his last hope, and that was the only thing he had left to hold on to. And then Mose just thought there was something off about this. So he ended up figuring out that John claimed the organization had found him, aka Mose, in November 2010, which was, when the boys vanished. But Mose's TV show hadn't even aired until 2012. Mose had been Amish. It's not like he was out and about and everybody knew who he was. Like, he was pretty much living under the radar. And nobody would have known anything about him other than him having this TV show. So at least a part of this underground society theory that had to do with Mose was completely fabricated. Which just goes to show, how much of what John's saying can we actually believe? Now, let's hear from John's family, because they paint a very different picture to the one we hear from Tanya and her family, and the majority of the media, to be honest, because John's family were totally scrutinized in the beginning when the boys went missing, and because of this, they just went completely silent. And, that's why most of the story we have, most of the information we have is one-sided. It's kind of all in favour of Tanya, apart from her history. But anyway, you can't really sugarcoat that. But let's just listen to them now, right? John was able to meet with his parents while he was in prison. And when his mother came out from this meeting, she was speaking to reporters and she said with certainty that his boys are safe and sound. Now, she didn't know where they were, but she knew they were okay. What possible evidence could she have to know this without actually knowing where they are or seeing them or speaking to them or something? Like, how does that add up? And my big question is, why would she come out and say this if John himself was panicking at one point about this organisation having taken his kids and never bringing them back when they were only supposed to have them for a trial run for one night? But look, John's family trust John, and according to them, they know he's telling the truth, that he gave the kids to someone to protect them from Tanya, and they don't agree with what he did. They think he's absolutely stupid for doing it, but they were certain that he never would have hurt them. And they're also 100% convinced that Tanya was abusing the boys. So this really makes you question things, you know. They are not wavering on that. They are 100% sure that Tanya was abusing them. So what do we believe? And apparently John had gone to authorities prior to the boys' disappearance and told them about Tanya's abuse of the boys. But of course, the police had no record of that. It doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it does mean that they had no record of that. I don't know. As for what happens now, like, surely the boys won't just be in hiding forever. His family believe that when they turn 18, they will come and find them. Does that mean when the oldest one turns 18? Well, no, because Andrew, being the oldest, would be 21 now. But it could mean when the youngest turns 18, Tanner, who would be 17 now and 18 in October 2023. Maybe we should all be holding our breath until October, November 2023. Maybe. But I'll let you decide what you think about that. Now, another reason why John's family believe this wholeheartedly is because John's father was approached by someone in Jacksonville, Florida. And this is a really weird interaction, okay? Weird encounter. He was approached from behind and this person said, "Don't turn around. Your grandchildren are safe." This story may or may not be true. And even if it is true, the person may or may not have been telling the truth or may not know anything about it. So that leaves about a 25% chance of it being true if we want to play those odds. But John's family also have ties to the Bahamas. A family member of his apparently flies over there a few times a year to service some lad's boat. And nowadays, Tanya likes to believe that that is where they are. That they're on the beach playing in the Bahamas and they're just having the time of their lives and they're absolutely fine. Look, I mean, it's not beyond the realms of possibility, but it's probably not the most likely situation. Like, it's a little far-fetched. Look, I get it. Of course they don't want to believe that their son John will be capable of hurting these 3 precious boys, and they could very well be in denial. It could just be too painful to even consider him having done anything to them. I mean, how else could they be 100% sure like they claim to be? As a side note, here's another story that John had put out on multiple occasions. He said he gave the boys to the Amish. Now, Amish country is only about 30 miles from Morenci, Michigan. And of course, if he had done this, I'm sure the Amish would take great care of the boys. But I'm also sure they would have known that these boys were missing and contacted authorities. They would hardly just harbour them and hide them, you know? And when some members of the Amish community were interviewed, they said that they get a fresh newspaper every day, every single day. And I mean, they don't have the internet or Netflix or anything like that. So it's definitely one of the only sources of entertainment and connection with the outside world. And they would have heard about the Skelton brothers, and most of them had heard about them. And they said that it would be impossible that this could happen and that nobody would have heard about it. Now let's talk about some newer leads. In late 2017, a fresh lead came out, finally. Like, it took 7 years, you know? but a box of teeth and bone fragments are found in a shed in Missoula, Montana, which, if you'll remember, is where the case of Jermaine Charlo took place, a case I covered a while back. But the thing about these teeth and bone fragments is they were of 3 children between the ages of 2 and 10 years old. So for that period of time, between finding them and getting them tested and getting the results back, people were holding their breath, hoping for this to be the answer, but also hoping that it wasn't the answer, because if it was the answer, that would be direct proof that the boys weren't alive anymore. And you can't possibly hope for that when they could maybe be out there somewhere. And when the results did eventually come back, they realised that actually these remains were over 99 years old or something like that. So it couldn't have been the boys. The next lead that came out was in May of 2019, when someone gave in a tip saying that she spotted this man matching John Skelton's description on Thanksgiving Day in 2010 in a van that matched the description of John's van at a pond in Ohio, just south of Morenci. Now, investigators took this very, very seriously because it matched what they also knew about the case. It matched the phone records. I'm a little confused about that personally, because wasn't it Black Friday morning when John's phone went towards Holiday City and everything? And weren't the boys actually seen outside playing on Thanksgiving morning, and didn't Tanya hear them on the phone? I don't know. Regardless, this area had already been marked as a hot zone in the case, so this pond was searched thoroughly. They used sonar, they used cadaver dogs, divers, everything they possibly could have. I mean, the police in this case they did not leave any stone unturned. They also searched the surrounding wooded areas, and still they found absolutely nothing. No, anywhere in this search, anywhere. And the only part of this area that wasn't searched was a private property. And some people believe that this must be the location that holds the answers we're all looking for. Let's just talk theories and thoughts and insights. First of all, maybe it's easier for John mentally to believe that the boys are with some family somewhere, that they are alive and well, even if he was the one that brought harm upon them. Like, maybe he had some kind of psychotic break. He has no recollection of what he did. It is possible. I mean, did he actually kill the boys? If so, why? Like, would he really go to the extent of ending his 3 beloved sons' lives to hurt his wife? Because why else would he kill them? How are you protecting them from her if you end their lives? I suppose given the state of his house on Black Friday, with the pure destruction that they came across, and the fact that he allegedly attempted to take his own life, he must have been going through something mentally, something big. They never found any blood or any sign of injury or anything like that in John's home, but that doesn't necessarily mean he didn't kill them. Let's not ignore those very intense Google searches on Thanksgiving night to do with rat poison and killing kids. You can't ignore that. As much as he claims that it was to do with a movie they watched, f***ing hell, bullshit. But if so, where did he put their bodies? Maybe there was something to the dumpsters in and around Holiday City, but honestly, it's just not a very satisfying answer, even if it is the right answer, because they'll probably never be found then. I would like to know if John has seen the age-progressed photos, and if so, how did he react? Because I just feel like if he himself had done something, surely this would have been intensely emotional. The most recent age-progressed photos show them at 19, 17 and 15, but they would now be 21, 19 and 17. Also, how come the boys were absolutely fine until Tanya couldn't give John a yes about being back together? It doesn't quite add up, because ever since then, his story has been that he wanted to protect the boys from Tanya because she was abusing them. So why? Why would you want to get back together with someone that you knew was abusing your sons? To me, it almost seems like he's played this narrative over and over and over so many times in his head that has become his truth now. That is now what he genuinely believes. But that in reality, that wasn't the case at all. The thing is, according to Tanya, John is very intelligent, calculating and selfish. And according to John, Tanya is very manipulative and will make you believe whatever she wants you to believe. And nobody's perfect. But that doesn't matter, right? Somebody knows. Somebody knows what happened to these 3 boys. The police believe they were killed by John and that he's the only one that has that information and will never even share it with anyone. And that is very possible. John was denied parole in August of this year, 2022. His out date is 3 years from now, and less than 1 year from now, Tanner would be turning 18. So maybe we will find out more. I have a lot of hope that we will, but all will be revealed. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please go ahead and give it a thumbs up. It means the world to me. And share your thoughts in the comments below. I'm sure you have plenty of thoughts, and I'm sure there have been plenty of things that have crossed your mind that haven't even come into my circumference. Go ahead and check out the Patreon to help me keep this channel going. It is tough to keep it going, I'm not gonna lie. But even if one extra person joined the Patreon, that would help a lot. It would help a lot, so that I don't have to give this up prematurely, because that's something I really do not want to have to do. On the Patreon, you get early access to all videos, you get the outtakes, deeper discussion, voting rights on what videos I should do next. And yeah, it'd be great to see you over there. If you found this one interesting, I would encourage you to go ahead and watch this one next. This girl was missing for 3 weeks before anyone even knew she was missing, before anyone even noticed, which is insane. Other than that, I'll see you in the next one. Happy holidays, and I'll see you soon. Bye guys.